be able to share.
So thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your attendance and participation in this event. We're really excited about the topic, and off the bat, just want to thank our wonderful speakers for joining us today and speaking to us on this important topic. And of course, our co-chairs for the Youth and Development Workgroup, Christy and Matthew. As always, thank you for your support and putting this these events together. I just want to point out, I know my colleague just posted the notes about a few housekeeping things for today's event, including the flyer, as well as a few notes. So everyone will be muted, except for the speakers during the course of today's event. So that's how this will work. If you have any questions, for those who are joining us via video chat, you can post them in the chat box, and Heidi, our moderator for today, will get to them at the end of the event. So that's something, so no limits on when you can post questions. You can post them whenever you feel like doing so, and interact with each other in the chat box. A few other things, if you're joining us via phone, we will have you, if you have questions, you can feel free to speak up, or there is a raise hand feature, which should be #9. So you can do that, and then we'll be able to call on you. And then if you want to mute or unmute, it's #6. So that's for those of us who are joining us via phone. And as just one last note to wrap up, we're going to have a whole bunch of programming coming up. We're still planning a few things. We only have, I know, 2 events listed for the rest of the month, but there should be a lot more programming coming up after that. So stay tuned to our and keep your eyes open. Our website will have all the updated information. And with that, I'll hand it off to our co-chairs to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Really glad to see that we have a good number of folks joining us today. I know this has been a difficult time for everyone, but we were really happy to be able to put this event together and have everyone join us virtually. We have some great speakers lined up for today. I think you're going to really enjoy today's session. This was a topic that came up as one of our top 3 topics that members wanted to hear about. And so we're going to be focusing on community-based youth crime and violence prevention. Some of the topics that we'll talk about today are related to the latest research on what works in community-based violence prevention, the importance of using a trauma-informed lens, how to incorporate family-based approaches, and of course, the importance of bringing youth voice into violence prevention activities. So we look forward to your questions and some sharing of your own experiences. Let me take a minute to introduce our speakers to you. First, we have Dr. Heidi Carr. Heidi is with the Education Development Center. She's an international mental health expert and a licensed clinical psychologist with specific expertise in violence and trauma. She has national and international expertise in designing, training, and evaluating evidence-based interventions focused on the prevention and or treatment of trauma disorders, violent behavior, substance abuse disorders, and suicide. And as Paul mentioned, Heidi's going to be helping us moderate today's session. We also have Dr. Trish Campy. She's a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research. Trish has more than 23 years of experience leading community-based research, evaluation, and implementation science initiatives. She recently completed a review of the global evidence base for preventing and reducing lethal violence among youth and young adults to identify interventions suitable for implementation in Latin America and Caribbean context. So looking forward to hearing Trish share some of her experience and information gathered during that research today. We also have Dr. Eric Alda. He is a criminology and public policy expert working at Creative Associates. He has extensive experience working on crime and violence, citizen security, and development issues in most of Latin America and the Caribbean. and Sub-Saharan Africa. He's currently a project director in the Citizen Security Practice at Creative and a faculty fellow in the School of Justice, Law, and Criminology at American University. And last but not least, we have Tyler Grigsby, who's a program facilitator at One Common Unity. Tyler is an educator, artist, activist, and photographer for Washington, D.C. Prior to facilitating programs at One Common Unity, Tyler supported high school youth across the district in using photography and community organizing as tools to create the change they want to see in their city. So we're really glad to have Tyler joining us today as well. So let me go ahead and pass it to Heidi, who's going to kick us off for today's session.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning, everyone. Just bear with me as I get my slides up here. Let me know if that is not coming through. Somebody. Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel today. You know, for those of you who don't know EDC, as Christy said, we're a large nonprofit. We have US and international divisions, and the majority of our work focuses on education, teaching, and workforce development innovations, both face-to-face and virtual innovations. And, you know, just to be very upfront, I always like to give the perspective I'm speaking from, and I'm speaking to you from the perspective of someone who's researched, but also treated victims of violence and perpetrators. So I've done a lot of rehabilitation, treatment of those who use violence against others. And so you'll see that I bring some of that today. So I wanted to start by setting the stage so that we're all thinking about violence for the multifaceted topic that it is. You know, violent behavior is inextricably linked to past trauma for many people. And that linkage has been something that we have a lot of evidence on in terms of understanding what the different pathways are from past trauma to violence and back again. And so it's really important, I think, that we not take the topic of violence as a static issue and think of that's where the discussion starts. There's a lot that predates someone's use of violence and a lot that comes after that can continue that cycle or that can lead to cessation of violence and healing. So just a little bit of review for most people. You know, there are 7 forms of violence according to the World Health Organization. Self-directed violence includes self-harm and suicide type behavior. A lot of people don't think about suicide as being part of the violence constellation, but it is. And I also just want to point out, you'll see this 8th box of witnessing down in the bottom right. And, you know, decades of research has made clear that children who witness violence between parents or in the community are as at high risk and in many times increased risk for negative outcomes than children who directly experience victimization. So it's really important to think about that as all of our experts today give you a glimpse into their work. We're talking a lot of times about people who have directly experienced or people who are directly perpetrating violence, but all of those other children in our communities who witness that are negatively affected. So important to keep that in mind. So as I mentioned, you know, we know that unresolved trauma leads to several different pathways to violent behavior. I say unresolved because most people are able to heal from trauma. And so I never want people to go away from these kinds of conversations thinking everyone who've experienced some kind of traumatic event will go on to, you know, have huge difficulties and perpetrate violence. Not at all. But unresolved trauma, we know through excellent psychological, neuropsychological research evidence over the years, leads to problems relating with people, so leads to relationship problems on multiple levels, leads to insufficient coping skills in many cases. And one of the key insufficient kind of coping skills that we see as being linked very closely to violence is substance use. And we know that, for some people, substance use really heightens both the risk of perpetrating violence and the severity of whatever the violence is that they will perpetrate. So it's important to think, at the individual level, and you'll hear a little bit about individual level interventions today, but also the family level. If you have a family in which one or both parents has experienced unresolved trauma and they have difficulty relating well to their children and to each other, and they haven't developed appropriate coping skills to deal with distress, to deal with anger, all of that is being learned by the children, right? And so this cycle kind of continues. So important to also start thinking about the levels, right? Individual, family, community, and our panelists are going to touch on all of these today. And so we know at all of these different levels, individual, family, and community, that trauma and violence are linked in a cyclical fashion. And one of the most interesting things to me that we don't talk enough about, and I hope you all keep this in mind today, is obviously those people who experience trauma may be more likely, we know in some cases, to perpetrate violence. But what's not discussed is those people who perpetrate violence very often experience trauma as a result of what they've done. And so many of us who have worked with veterans, who've worked with military populations, know some of the most severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma-related dysfunction comes from people who have perpetrated violence against others and are living with that reality. So again, another interrelationship to keep in mind. I've spoken already about kind of the effects of trauma on children and how this is an intergenerational issue, but attachment problems, mental health problems, aggression and bullying in school, problems achieving in school are all aspects of unresolved trauma. And if we think very broadly about each of these areas, we can see that this kind of experience, if the right supports and the right healing mechanisms are not provided, really do set the course for many people's lives. School achievement problems lead directly to much more limited options in terms of economic stability, in terms of places in the world that are open to that person in terms of a work sense. So it's just important to kind of think of the whole context. There's a link, happy to share the slides later. We don't have a lot of time now. That is fantastic. It leads to a video which really gets into the specifics of the neurobiological effects of witnessing, as we talked about before, and exactly what's happening in the brain to create some of the lasting change that we see. And finally, just a few words on EDC's work and our approach to the fact that violence is so multifaceted, and it's not, going back to the chicken or the egg, it's not necessarily where things start, and it's not necessarily where things end. We do a lot of work in enhancing mental resilience and coping skills in youth and caregivers all around the world. So we bring evidence-based mental health principles and interventions to school and community settings, really trying to hone in on those different pathways that I shared with you that we know are kind of how unresolved trauma and extreme hardship in many of the areas we work in lead to violence if not curtailed and if not given the correct support. So distress tolerance skills. So we teach, what do you do when you're angry? So this is anger management skills. This is when you're really upset. What is it that you do? What is it that you can do? And how do some of those help in the moment? How do some of those help you longer term? Focusing on healthy coping skills, coming at it from an acceptance perspective. We all have to cope with negative things in our life. Let's build those skills in both learners, but also those people who care for them. Because again, that modeling aspect is crucial to break that cycle of violence in families and communities. And we really focus on cognitive behavioral awareness and skill building so that youth and educators and caregivers really understand that our thoughts are what lead to our feelings, which lead to our behaviors. And that if we're going to really make a lasting difference in whether we are violent or not, or in all types of negative behaviors, we have to work on the way we think. We have to be able to change our perspective. We have ongoing work in these areas in Honduras, the DRC, Lebanon, and Iraq, but I don't want to take up any more time because we have an excellent group of panelists here to tell you about their work. So I will pass it on to Dr. Campy.
Great, thank you so much, Heidi. Let me share my screen now. Give me a second here, and I'll pull it up. And please let me know if you can't see what I'm presenting. So what I'm going to be talking with you all about today, and thank you so much for tuning in this morning. I'm going to be talking about a study that USAID commissioned AIR to do in partnership with Democracy International under a task order that we are fulfilling for the agency. And this is a study that looked at the evidence base for interventions affecting youth violence. And it's a global review because we recognize that most of the research doesn't come from the region. So our aim was to do a global review and see what might be applicable to the Latin America and Caribbean region. And the reason why the agency is so focused in this area is because, as you can see from this chart, the population in the Latin America and Caribbean region is only about 8% of the world's population, but it represents about a third of the world's homicides. So really disproportionate amount of violence going on in the region. And when you zoom in a little bit closer, you can see that the Northern Triangle areas and the northern tips of South America are the places that really have the most, the highest rates of death in the area. I mean, what this doesn't show you is where things have been improving. And one place to point out is in Colombia, just southwest of Venezuela, there at the top of the South America map. They have made remarkable reductions in the most violent cities in that country over the past 15 years, in Cali and Medellin in particular, which gives hope, right, that you actually can make changes here. It's not all is lost. So we know from those experiences that violence can be reduced, but a review that was done in 2016 by Thomas Abt and Associates found that, you know, there was not a single experimental study at that time of interventions done in the region on this topic. So USAID wanted to take another look with the study that we just completed a few months ago, and that was the purpose of the work and what I'm going to show you today. So if you're not familiar with evidence gap mapping, what it is, it's an approach that provides a framework, essentially. It's an organizing system to pull in all the different intervention research that we can find from evaluations and studies that have a level of rigor to them. So a comparison group, a control group, something where you have a reasonable expectation that the results can be generalizable. And we also, knowing in advance that there would be few studies from the region, we also wanted to look at some new areas of research that might be unpublished and not out in the literature yet. So we kind of had a twofold approach to this work. We examined research that was available to us, either published or unpublished reports, over a 17-year period from 2000 to 2017. We looked at systematic reviews Those are reviews of research that include multiple studies all at once, so it's a more efficient way to go about this work. And then we also looked at individual unpublished studies, as I said, to fill gaps once we had completed our first step at looking at what was published. We looked worldwide. We had multiple staff at AIR and Democracy International who were fluent in different languages. So we looked at pretty much anything you can imagine, and I'll show you the countries in a minute. USAID defines youth as 10 to 29 years of age, so that was the age range we were looking at in terms of the intervention reach. And we were looking at violence prevention broadly, all typologies. So Heidi showed, the 7 types plus witnessing. So we included all of those. And as I said before, the study needed to be research or evaluation. We weren't looking at, literature reviews or book chapters or theoretical studies of any kind. So this just shows you where we started at the very top. We identified 456 published articles or reports that might be okay for the review. But the way these mapping studies go is you always end up with a much smaller number, usually 10%, and that's pretty much what we ended up with at the very bottom here. In the gray box, it says included. At the end of the day, we relied on 46 articles. That doesn't mean 46 different studies. There, some of these studies had hundreds of articles in them. But 46 articles were reviewed and analyzed. So the good news just straight away is that the Latin America and Caribbean region actually was included in 9 studies, which is 9 more than was found in the APT review in 2016. So that's a finding in itself, which we were glad to see. And then you can see the other 30 countries from which we pulled studies as well. So it was very, very broad. The participants across these studies, most of them were under the age of 18, and this will relate back to a finding about, the focus being on the folks who may not necessarily be the most at risk for committing violence, but that's who are currently being included in the interventions that are being studied. Only one study examined gender-specific or responsive violence programming. 6 studies provided no age or gender for participants. These were community-based studies, so it makes it difficult to know who's being targeted. Parents were part of the intervention approach in about 1/3 of the studies, so a pretty decent amount. About 1/4 of studies described interventions that were serving justice-involved youth, meaning that they already had some contact with law enforcement or were currently incarcerated. And then just 20% of studies described interventions that serve gang-involved youth. And again, pointing to the fact that maybe a lot of the research and a lot of the program is not necessarily focusing on those at the highest risk for violence. So what this shows you are the different prevention levels that interventions we're working at. So the dark blue are primary interventions, and those are interventions that really target any young person in that age group, 10 to 29, regardless of the risk you're at for violence. The secondary programs are the red ones, and these are things that are trying to work with young people that have some indication they might be in a risk group. So they haven't necessarily committed any violence themselves, but maybe they have some underlying issues going on. They're in a high crime neighborhood, things like that. So they're at higher risk, and they may not be doing great at school. They may have some other risk factors, but they're not necessarily committing violence themselves. The light blue, the tertiary, that's about 25% of the interventions we found. These are the people who have already committed violence and are most at risk for future violence, as Heidi said. So this isn't a one-time deal. And then almost half of the interventions were unclear or were targeting multiple interventions. So, across these 3 different levels. Continuing down on the left side, the structure of the interventions, we know from past research that when interventions are highly structured and manualized and there's fidelity and staff know what the purpose is of the intervention, they generally produce the expected results. But when interventions are just, put a bunch of kids in a room, have them, play games together or do exercise, like those sorts of things are not effective, generally speaking. So we found that just a little more than half used a structured curriculum. Less than a quarter had formal training for the staff, and less than a quarter had structured activities themselves. So not really tracking with the best practice here in the structure of the interventions. To the right side, this is just the intervention focus areas. So this shows you the kinds of interventions that we found in the studies. And what I have in the red here are the highest number of types. So gun violence prevention interventions, at least among the group, and then school-based programs were the next most common type of intervention. But you can see it really ranges, the kinds of interventions we found. Schools were most often the place where these interventions happened, followed by neighborhood social service organizations and homes. But I will say that implementation information was very incomplete and very inconsistent in about a third of the studies. So that's about 15 of the studies. And as I mentioned, each study could have anywhere from a few studies within it to 100 studies. So we're talking about a lot of interventions for which we actually don't have good implementation information. The kinds of outcomes that were measured, so it's important, when you're looking at the research to understand, well, okay, we know what the program is, but what are the outcomes they're supposed to affect? And we found that the outcomes were kind of all over the place. Some were not even violence related necessarily, but they were called violence prevention programs. And you can kind of see the way this breaks down. The most common outcome measured was violence against a person. So that was in 61% of the studies. And then the next most common outcome measured was community violence at 37%. I will say though, within those categories, we had almost 70 different types of violence that were being measured. So it makes it very hard to really have a consistency to communicating what the research is telling us about these programs. So here we get to probably the $64,000 question. What you all want to know is, well, what about, which of these interventions were effective? So what I've highlighted here are the interventions that show positive intervention effects. And of those 45 studies that we looked at, 52% of them, so a little more than half, reported positive intervention effects. This means on every measure that the study was attempting to understand, there was a positive outcome for the intervention. And you'll notice that the most successful interventions were at the tertiary level. So these are the things that are highlighted in red, both in the column and in the rows. And you can see that there were 6 of them on this list that were effective, as opposed to the primary prevention, there were just 2, the secondary, there were just 2, and the programs that really didn't distinguish, there were just 3. And this is going to be a theme throughout our results. And I think in the literature in general, I wasn't surprised by this, because these are the individuals who are most likely to commit future violence. So if you're targeting these folks and giving them what they need to change their thinking and address their trauma and help them find legitimate means of work and everything else they need, you are going to make a much bigger dent in your violence issues. We also had just a little bit of half of the studies, 48% of them reported mixed effects. So what this means is that some of the outcomes from the intervention were positive, others there was no effect, and sometimes there was a harmful effect. So what you see here is that the interventions that work across multiple levels are the ones with mixed effects. And this is not surprising to me necessarily, because it goes back to what I was saying a minute ago, that when you have an intervention that's very clear in terms of a structured curriculum. You know exactly who you're working with. The staff are trained. They have a very clear idea of kind of the theory of change. They implement it very consistently. You have better outcomes. So when you think about an intervention that's trying to reach multiple populations, that gets very complicated, right? And then your ability to train staff, have a structured way to do it, and do it with fidelity is probably not as great. So I think that's what explains these. I have aggression replacement training and violence interruption in yellow because these are, so previous research on these two types of intervention had found them to be effective. And then the latest reviews, now that we have a little more research under our belt, has found that we're not so sure. So those are kind of to be continued, I would say. We're not really sure. There were limitations in the studies we reviewed. The limitations cited by the authors of these studies, 10% cited low number of female participants, which we found to be true as well. 15% of the authors reported they didn't have the data they needed to understand what was happening with actual crime from a police perspective. A little more than a quarter, they excluded, studies from their research if it wasn't published. And the reason that can be a problem is that there's something called publication bias. And for any of you that have tried to get an article of your own published, whether it's in the local newspaper or a research journal, you know that they don't just automatically say yes. So in violence prevention research, the bias is towards urban settings, large population studies, and while that's all great, there's a lot that you're missing when you don't understand what's happening in rural studies or in unusual populations that are rare and that sort of thing. So that's why it can be a bias. We also observed limitations, our own research team, in looking at this giant corpus of research. So one of the limitations we observed is that changes in individual violent behavior were rarely measured. And that might sound really odd to you. Well, how do you know the intervention is effective if they're not measuring individual violent behavior? The answer to that is that the way that they set up the measures to look at outcomes, it could be that the measure is, I don't have as much antisocial thinking anymore. So that's a really common outcome that we saw measured in these studies, but it doesn't tell you whether that person is translating that change in thinking to a change in behavior. So it's a pretty big limitation of this research base that we thought was important to note. We also noted that about 20% of the studies were conducted by individuals connected to the intervention. So a lot of times these interventions are created by researchers, and then the researchers are the ones who study them. So that can obviously give you, maybe some concerns about independence. And then the intervention fidelity, so the researchers really understanding how the intervention was implemented, as I said before, was rarely measured as in terms of the outcome. So, very hard to know whether the quality of the implementation and the fidelity, meaning that they implemented it pretty much the same way with each person, whether those things were related to the outcomes. I mean, we know from past research in the crime and justice field that implementation fidelity is related to outcomes, but in this corpus of studies, most researchers did not include any analysis like that. And then the last one, even though we used randomized controlled trials, RCTs, those are experimental studies where you have an intervention group and then you have a control group, people who are similar but who did not receive the intervention. Even though some of the studies used those designs, they were very small sample sizes. And this is not new. You all might be familiar with the Perry High School experiment, not high school meaning older kids, but it's a preschool called the Perry High School, and it was done years and years ago. And it's considered a violence prevention, program, and that study was just a little more than 100 kids in it. So it's not uncommon to have the small sample sizes, but it does lead to some statistical concerns. The evidence gaps we found from our study, that, as I said, there really weren't behavioral outcomes being measured, so that's a gap that needs to be filled. Only one study included a discussion of program costs. We were very surprised by that. So we don't have good evidence about how much it costs to run an effective program and how that translates into savings in terms of lives and health prevention. We really don't have enough evidence around program implementation, as I said, and there was not a single longitudinal study, meaning that there wasn't a single study that looked at changes in violent behavior over time or victimization. And as Heidi mentioned, this is a dynamic process, and a young person exposed to violence, before the age of 5 is more likely at the age of 80 to still be experiencing violence than somebody who didn't have that exposure as a child. It doesn't mean they will experience it as an 80-year-old, but they're more likely to experience it. So we really need to understand the longitudinal nature of violence, and there were no studies in this global review. The last piece I'll say is that there really was not much coherence in terms of theory or definitions. The 7 types of violence that Heidi showed was not mentioned in a single study. So just to give you an idea that there's not really an anchor of the way we think about violence prevention, and that makes it very difficult to combine the results of these studies into very clear guidance for policymakers. We found one systematic review of studies from the LAC region, but that, again, was one more than existed before. It included 9 studies within it, which was great. Only a couple of studies looked at violence against family members or between intimates. And again, these are systematic review studies. They're not individual studies that you may be familiar with, so these are much larger scale that we're talking about. Only one of these studies looked at sexual violence. As I said before, only one looked at gender responsive interventions. And only one study looked at interventions involving employers, which, was a disappointing result, because I think those of us who do this work know, right, that employment is such a big part of the solution. It doesn't solve anything on its own, but it's a critical pathway for especially gang-involved youth to have if they want to create a new identity and move back into the community. So this is my last slide. The implications for this is that, funders, researchers, policymakers, we need to prioritize implementation and really make sure that the research is studying implementation and not just outcomes. Related to this, the researchers, I think, really need to do a better job working together and building consensus on the way we're defining violence and how we're measuring it. The research quality overall, it was not great. I didn't show you a slide on that. We measured it in a very precise way, and only about a quarter of the studies really passed the international standards for research quality. So it's a problem, and it ties back to funding and time and all of that, I'm sure. The fourth bullet, I think, is something we can really do something about quickly and in the near term, and that's focusing on the tertiary risk populations. And a lot of times policymakers, it's not like the general public is saying, hey, government, we want you to help this gang, or we want you to help this person who committed a homicide. Like, there's not a lot of sympathy for that population. But as Heidi mentioned, these folks, they're victims too. And the truth is 95% of people who go to prison are going to come out of prison. And when they come out of prison, if their issues are not resolved, they're going to continue to act out in a negative way, and violence is one of those things. So it really pays to focus on these populations and work within the community to identify, employers, education, social services, housing, who are willing and able to accept these folks and work with them. And then the last piece, and this is kind of a pie in the sky for me, but it's just revisiting the gold standard, which is experimental studies for studying community-based violence. I mean, I don't think there's anyone on this call that would probably disagree that, you know, it's not only is it very difficult to do an experimental study, but it can often be dangerous and unethical when you work with, you know, people at really, really grave risk for violence, you know, folks victimized by domestic abuse, gang violence. These are extremely delicate situations, and having an experimental study is not ethical, right, and very dangerous. So there are other ways we can examine these interventions, and I think we just need to come together and figure that out and not just publish things that are experimental, which only give us, you know, a little glimpse into this issue. So that's all I had for you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions as we go.
All right, and I think Dr. Alda is next.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the Society for International Development for inviting us to this webinar. Let me share my screen and let me know if you guys see it. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna present about program we have at Creative Associates in Honduras, and the title of my presentation is Proponte Más, which is the name of our program, using evidence-based interventions to reduce violence and gang joining in Honduras. But first, I would like to read you a couple of quotes, and I'll let you know why afterwards. So the first quote is, "We always do something as a ritual when my dad is at home on Sunday to share with the family. We have lunch together, or we may go out of town." And the second quote is, "When I have a problem, I first talk to my spouse and explain what is happening to our daughter. We then sit down and discuss the pros and cons to make sure our daughter resolves this issue." So this is a rough translation of two quotes. You would think that this is just a, you know, regular family doing something on the weekend, or, you know, trying to sort out issues that they have with the daughter. But it turns out that these are beneficiary families of our family counseling intervention. So these were families that before the intervention had issues of communication, had poor family organization, and they had children that were, you know, at risk of violence or gang joining. So this is part of a qualitative evaluation that I will talk a bit about during the presentation, where you can see that the intervention actually affected change in the way they communicate, in the way they do things together, in the way they organize, and the same with the kids. So with that, I'm moving on to the presentation. Let me show you the organization. I'm going to talk briefly about Proponte Más and what it is about. Then I'm going to talk about the family assistance approach, the family counseling intervention that we implemented in Honduras in some of the most violent communities in 5 municipalities. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact evaluation, the design and some of the results, a qualitative evaluation, then cost-benefit analysis that we did on the program, and then finally I would like to show the video that was prepared about our fantastic communication teams that I think summarizes what Proponte Más is all about. So let me talk a little bit about Proponte Más. Proponte Más is a 4-year USA-funded program implemented in 5 municipalities working with at-risk youth ages 8 to 17 years old and their families. It had 5 results or objectives. The first one was at-risk youth receiving secondary prevention services in targeted communities. Then the second one was to support services provided for eligible youth and their families in those targeted communities. Then establish a cadre of family counselors, so it's a way of living capacity installed in the country when the project ends. And then strengthen alternative justice measures, especially with those institutions that are working with youth in tertiary prevention, or those youth who are already in conflict with the law, and then establish a community-based secondary prevention model. The focus of the conversation would be, or my talk rather, would be on Unresolved 1, because that's where we have the most evidence about how our intervention works. So essentially, the technical approach of Proponte Más, you would say there's maybe a three-pronged approach, so to say. The first step is to administer a risk assessment tool, which I will talk a little bit about, called the IMC, which is this is a Spanish acronym, but in English would be the behavior measurement tool. And that tool helps us identify those youth who are at risk of engaging in risky behavior or joining gangs. Those who are at risk or who are or identified as a risk then will be eligible to receive the prevention intervention family system model, which is the family counseling intervention that is part of the treatment. Then the intervention, it's a 6-month intervention, includes 7 phases. The first one is administering the tool to identify whether you are at risk or not. And then, family counselor or a group of family counselors provides guidance to youth and their families to work through their issues, how they organize, how they communicate, try to strengthen cohesion, and then go through each of the phases. And then at the end of the 7th phase, then they're reevaluated to see whether or not there was an improvement or a decline in risk factors. It's also worth noting that during the pre-intervention and the post-intervention, we also collected data on several family dimensions with a tool called the phases. And these dimensions included like cohesion, flexibility, and communication. So the first step of this initial risk evaluation of the IMC, the behavioral measurement tool, collects information on risk and protective factors, but particularly on the risk factors, we collect information on antisocial tendencies, weak parental supervision, critical life events, impulsive risk-taking, neutralization of guilt, negative peer influence, peer delinquency, the influence of gangs in the family, and then crimes and substance use. It's worth noting that this tool has been validated extensively. In fact, it was contextualized to Honduras. The original tool was called the YSED, which is the Youth Service Eligibility Tool. This was developed in LA as part of their gang reduction strategy and helped them identify those youth who were at risk of, secondary or tertiary violence, and then were eligible for family counseling intervention. Normally, they will contextualize it, we validate it also, together with scholarly research that has been done in developed countries, particularly the US or the UK, to be able to have a tool that would be able to capture risky behavior among youth in the case of Honduras. So once we apply the tool, if a youth scores 4 or plus in the number of risk behaviors, of risk domains that I just presented before, then he or she is identified as being a secondary or tertiary risk. So the more risky behavior you have, then you will be a secondary or tertiary. So for example, a secondary is a youth that shows certain truancy in school, is flirting with gangs, he has bad company, doesn't behave very well at home. And then a tertiary one would be a youth that has already been in conflict with the law or maybe in a gang, right? So these youth then are eligible for the family counseling intervention. So the family counseling intervention, as I said before, is 7 phases. The first one was applying the tool, and then the youth and the families work with a cadre of counselors, a clinical counselor. These are trained psychologists, to work with families on this family counseling approach. So Perponte has the trained, a cadre of clinical psychologists to be able to assist families in each of their phases. So the counselors work together as a strategy team that collaborates, can monitor and discuss and adjust each family plan. So the family is treated as a unique system, and then each counselor works with them, to figure out what is it that they need to adjust, whether they're, working or they're progressing adequately within each of the phases. And then as they progress adequately, then they move on to the next phase. So this intervention takes 6 months. Sometimes in other projects that we have created, it takes up to a year. We found that 6 months seems to be the optimal amount of time to conduct this intervention. So after the first one, then you go into phase 2, because it's called build agreements. And the phase 3 So it's called redefine problem solution. Then phase 4, you celebrate change. The family is already coming together. And then phase 5, you integrate. And then phase 6, you kind of move on to next level agreements on how the family will work together, communicate moving forward. And then the last phase, that's where we reevaluate. We apply the same tool we applied at pre-intervention to see actually if the youth had improve or decline in the number of risk factors. And then we also apply the phases to see if those family dimensions that I mentioned before have also improved or declined after the intervention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evaluation design. So we did an RCT in 5 municipalities in Honduras. These are the USA identifies them as, target municipalities to reduce violence in the mid and long term. So the RCT was stratified by 14 zones. We applied the IMC, the service to about 4,500 youth. And then out of those, about 950, exactly 944 were deemed to be at risk. In other words, they score 4 or more factors in that tool. Those were the ones that we randomized in order to provide the intervention, the family counseling. Out of those, 463 were assigned to a treatment group. Those were the ones together with the families that received the family counseling. And then 481 were assigned to the control group that, receive other type of services. The balancing test did show that there were no statistically significant differences between the treatment and control group. So it could be argued that any changes could be attributed to the impact of the program, right? Changes between the treatment and control group at end line. There was some attrition. This is natural. Kids end up dropping out for many reasons. However, there were no difference between those who dropped out and those who were still in the program. So essentially, again, could be argued that differences at the end of the program could be attributed to impact of the family counseling. So Arizona State University conducted the evaluation, and then they did, a bunch of analyses that, measure direct effects of the intervention and also indirect effect. So the direct effect, factors, as I said before, the tool measures both risk and protective factors. What we saw was a statistically significant decline in the treatment group in weak parental supervision, rebelliousness, and the social tendencies, and impulsive risk-taking. In other words, at the end of the treatment, youth in the treatment group actually experience a decline in 4 out of the 9 risk factors, right? And then among the protective factors, we saw an improvement in opportunities for prosocial involvement, opportunities for family prosocial involvement, and interaction with prosocial peers. So they strengthen the protective factors, which can also help mitigate the influence or effect of the risk factors. The indirect effects, so essentially what ASU wanted to do was to see that, the theory of change basically posits that if there are improvements within the family, then those will affect, risk factors and eventually outcomes in terms of delinquency and violent behavior, etc. So if that is true, then the family improvements in some of these scales or dimensions within the family would actually lead to reduction in risk factors and then reduction in, delinquency outcomes. So what we found in direct effects, or ASU rather, it was that improved family communication and satisfaction led to a decrease in overall risk factors. So essentially, the family provided a moderating effect on the influence of all these external factors on risky behavior. So that led to a decrease in the overall risk factors. Essentially, the overall risk factors is a summary variable of the other risk factors that we capture in the IMC tool. At the same time, there was a reduction in poor family management, family conflict that also led to a reduction in delinquency. The 2 quotes that I mentioned or that I read to you in the beginning of my presentation kind of shows that, before the intervention, the family was not well organized, they had issues of communication, poor cohesion, that would, lead to higher risky behavior in the youth and potentially more engagement in delinquent and violent behavior. So clearly the intervention did show that not only did we reduce, have a direct reduction in risky behavior among youth, but also the family contributed to that reduction. And then finally, the other indirect effect was that, you know, there was an increased family attachment, there was increased family opportunities for pro-social involvement, there were family rewards for pro-social involvement, and then interaction with pro-social peers. Again, families, improvements in these family dimensions led to a reduction in delinquency. So the evaluation, what it has shown was that, you know, both direct effects and indirect effects seems to have a positive impact on the treatment group. One of the things that we found was that, and it's often discussed in this program, is that, well, are the tools and the mechanisms that this family and kids learn, do they persist over time, right? We don't really know, because we didn't have enough time to do like a, you know, a follow-up 2 years, 5 years down the road. So we decided, excuse me, we decided to do a qualitative evaluation with some clinical psychologists in the country to assess whether or not the impacts of this family counseling intervention would actually persist over time, right? So we collected a random sample of beneficiary families. There were about 120 families that had been out of the program 1 year and 6 months respectively. So essentially, a set of families had finished the intervention 1 year and 6 months, and then another one had finished the intervention 6 months ago. So in a way, we want to see over time if, you know, really that what they learned persisted, right? And then the evaluation followed 4 dimensions. One, it was cohesion, the other one is communication, then parental supervision, family organization. And the qualitative results showed that there was no difference in terms of persistence. So essentially, those who were out of the program 1 year and 6 months, and those who were out of the program 6 months, there was no difference between them in terms of what they learned, and, you know, and what they learned and what they were applying within their family unit. So we showed that that there was improvements in family communication. One of the quotes alludes to that. Also supervision. Families now and kids work together. You have issues of sometimes kids living out of the house. Mothers and fathers didn't know where they were. Now the kids at least let their families know, hey, I'm going out with my friends, or I'll be at these neighbors, so at least they know that they're not hanging out with unhealthy peers, right? And also cohesion. Families now work together. Families now do together, do things together, which is, you know, I think it attests to the effectiveness of the family counseling model within those 6 months, right? At the same time, these improvements in communication, supervision, and cohesion can also mitigate the effects of the external environment, right? Because at the end of the day, you do the treatment in the home, and then when the kids go outside, they're still exposed to some of these risk factors, right? Whether it's gang violence or unhealthy peers, but it seems that the strength of the family can help mitigate some of these effects. We also, and it's interesting that Trish mentioned in the other presentation, we were also interested in seeing whether, you know, the program was cost beneficial. It's often argued that these programs are very complex and often expensive. So you want to see if the benefits that, you know, the program provides in terms of like costs or impacts averted by the program, cost averted by the program, can actually outweigh the benefits, outweigh the overall cost of the program. So we did a cost benefit analysis in-house with, you know, with various scenarios and various discount rates. And then what we found was that Proponte Más at the end of its life was actually cost beneficial. So the value of benefits we found, depending on the scenario, was ranging between $4 and $5.4 million, and a benefit cost ratio ranging between 1.2 and 1.4. Those who are not familiar with cost benefit analysis, when you have a benefit cost ratio that is larger than 1, it means that the benefit, you know, outweigh the cost. So in a way, we have 3 ways of showing that our program has been impactful. One was the impact evaluation. Then the qualitative evaluation helps provide depth and context to the quantitative findings. And then the cost benefit actually shows that it was a good investment for Hondurans to do this kind of work. So to summarize the course, wish we have more time to discuss more about the program, but to summarize what we find is that, the findings were the quantitative and qualitative provide support for the propensity of change. As I said before, it posits that providing support to families with at-risk youth can mitigate the overall level of risk, increase their resilience, and at the same time improve family communication, cohesion, and organization, right? We also show that this model, which was developed in the context of an industrialized country, a developed country, in a city like LA, can actually be adapted in complex and violent environments, right? We've done this work in Honduras, which has been evaluated, but we've also done it, in a program that we had in the Caribbean. We've done it in El Salvador, and we've also done it in North Africa. We apply especially the tool, this IMC tool, also known as the YSET, and it shows that, after the intervention, there seems to be a reduction across the board in terms of risky behaviors among youth, right? At the same time, you have families that live in very difficult, complex environments, socioeconomic, demographic, and institutionally. Oftentimes institutions, national or local level institutions don't reach out to those communities. But we show that youth and families, if they want to, or when given the opportunity, are actually able to make changes and lasting changes that last beyond the life of the program, right? And then finally, what we show is that Proponte Más, it was a complex program to implement, but it's also a good bang for your buck, right? To reduce and prevent violence. We found that it was cost beneficial. We found that it had a good impact on youth and the families. And then, those impacts, as I said before, that last well beyond the life of the program. So let me show you this video that I think nicely summarizes what Proponte Más is all about. It's about 3 minutes, and then, I'll end here. The slide afterwards has a link where you can see other videos and more stuff about Proponte Más.
Eric, if I could just say, I'm a little bit concerned about time. I want to make sure that Tyler has a chance to speak and that we have time for questions. If we have time at the end, could we show the video?
Absolutely.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'll end here, and then I can show the video later, and then leave it at that. Thank you, guys.
Thanks everybody so far. Again, I'm Tyler Grigsby from One Common Unity in Washington, D.C. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now, if that works. Okay. Let's see. All right, does that work? Everybody seeing my slides, my title slide?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. I'm Tyler Grigsby. I work at an organization called One Common Unity. Those are that's our social media handle on Instagram and my own personal facilitator account at TyBylate. I'll share those again. But first I want to get into who we are. In the year of 2000, a group of young artists and educators came together in response to shootings in Washington, D.C. They wanted to use the arts, poetry, music to inspire youth to put down guns and stop violence. There was a lot of gun violence in Washington, D.C. There still is, but it's been getting better over the years. So now we've gone from a grassroots group of artists and educators to be a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to break cycles of violence and build compassionate, healthy communities through transformative power of music, arts, and peace education. So what that looks like is a mix of in-school and after-school programming. You've heard a lot from the other panelists about the data and why this matters. I'm here to kind of provide a case study and what that looks like in a grassroots approach in Washington, D.C. So we have a 5-pillared curriculum that we facilitate in school, after school, through summer programs, parent workshops, teacher trainings. And this is what that looks like. We do that through artistic expression, social emotional literacy, which is so much of what Heidi was talking about in the beginning, and Patricia, about all of those things like coping skills. We cover that in there, how to handle your emotions in healthy ways. Health and wellness, that's holistic mental and physical health. environmental leadership. It's really important, especially in the communities we're working in, to have a connection to nature and the earth. There's a lot of really interesting research about how beneficial time in nature can be to mental health. That really matters to us, and social justice. So looking at what are the root causes of the conditions that we're experiencing in our communities here. And what that looks like is that on average, 40% of youth deaths in Washington, D.C. are caused by homicide, which is compared to 13% nationally. So we primarily focus on youth ages 11 to 18. And many of them are dealing with community violence, poverty, high drug use, and rates of incarceration, which reinforces cyclical trauma. And so we have students who are experiencing all of those things, but we're in a very uniquely positioned community because Washington, D.C. also has students of diplomats, sometimes attending the same schools, right? So in our programs, which I'll get to in a little bit, we're dealing with students who are experiencing all of this, but we're also dealing with highly privileged young people who have a lot of access to resources, all in the same communities. So we're bringing those young people together, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that. So here is a photo of myself and my co-facilitator, John A. Wilson, and our youth organizing troop. When you first look at this photo, you see a group of like very diverse young people, right? This isn't necessarily what most youth groups look like in my community. So the context of Washington, D.C., we're a pretty racially and income segregated city. Here is a map of some of the median household incomes and also some racial demographics of the city. So if you see, that's a pretty, I'll toggle between the two. There's a pretty strong dividing line of the experiences of Washingtonians. What we do to get to this, which doesn't really represent what you see in those other sides, is working in 20 schools and community sites with our facilitators such as myself and mental health providers. So DC has 8 wards. That red dot that you see here is our office. And we're kind of right at the middle of a bunch of different intersecting communities. If you look, that's right where all the different dots overlap in this, and it's a multi-income space. So that's where our office is, but each of the blue dots is our community or school program sites, where we reach students through that 5-pillared curriculum. So I wanted to share the example of the organizing troop because it's uncommon to have been able to break down this many structural barriers to get a group like that in one space. In organizing troop, they're a group that came together on a summer retreat about to build a coalition. I'll get to that story in one moment. So here's some of the things that we've accomplished through One Common Unity's work. This needs to be updated because it says 15 schools. We're in 20 this year. But 84% of our students graduate high school, which is a lot higher than the DCPS average of 69%, slightly higher than the national average of 81%. 100% of our youth exhibit improved self-confidence, stronger leadership, and can identify 3 future goals. Those are huge protective factors for their involvement in violence work moving forward. So I'm gonna get through this quickly because I know time is limited, but one of the ways we do this is through summer retreat programs. So students from all our schools are given the opportunity to connect with other young people, develop protective factors and relationships with mentors. A great deal of our staff are alumni, and we grew up in the same communities that our students did, which really helps break down some of the barriers there. So I share the example of that group of students because the Social Justice Organizing Troop, it was a program conceptualized by youth on one of these summer retreats. All the youth were 13 to 15 years old. Most had been involved in leading in-school campaigns through our fly-by-light curriculum. So they had already had some relationship with program facilitators such as myself. They had some practice making a change in their schools, processing some of the things they've been through. Our model pairs facilitators like myself who do like school one, tier one social interventions. So we're providing like positive coping skills and expression through the arts, but we also have tiered interventions if it's more serious or they've already been involved in like violence or anything, or need more in-depth ways to address their traumas. We have mental health clinicians that also work with us. So these students had all been previously involved in some of those programs, and they were brought together on summer retreat from their different parts of the city, different schools, different backgrounds. And they were like, why don't we have a program that works on citywide violence all the time? As a facilitator, this is kind of like your dream scenario because they want to go bigger and deeper. But I was like, because nobody's started it, you know, like we can see what that would look like. What is your idea? And they're like, well, on summer retreat is the only time that we get to hear from different parts of the city. There's lots of, they're smaller than gangs here, but they're called crews, which basically function like neighborhood gangs. And a lot of that means that students who live in one neighborhood can't travel to another because of fears of violence, because of crew issues. So getting them out of the city into nature and breaking down all these things and really getting to explore and know each other through the arts breaks down a lot of those barriers. And it had taken that level of work to get to a point where they wanted to come together and wanted to meet every week in the city to work on these issues. So I'm pretty proud to say that we have 16 active members from 8 different high schools and over a dozen different neighborhoods, really all over that map that I shared earlier, which is really uncommon. And we were able to do that through the relationships that we built with them in their schools, through their parents, through multiple years of community engagement. And so this was their statement about their campaign. What this has emerged to is they're conducting community-led research, holding focus groups and a survey with other DC youth, because the primary issue that they care about right now is gun violence. They want to build a safe space for youth to be themselves, be connected with resources, mentors that they can relate to, break down barriers to accessing internet and social services, but also just have spaces to do something that aren't like academic or athletic focused, but are still positive. So it would be kind of like a rec center that also incorporates more comprehensive art and mentoring programs. So this was their mission statement for their campaign and a screenshot from their survey. So right now they're trying to survey as many of their peers as possible. We had to pivot a lot moving this campaign online, but their solution would be to get the city to invest in one pilot center of a youth space where there's trained counselors, conflict resolution staff, arts facilitators like myself. They wanted to track the data of that and then advocate for at least one in each ward around the city to start breaking it down and tailoring it to each neighborhood and ward's needs. Is that making sense so far? Thanks. Are there any questions about that process or about our work so far? Okay. I'm gonna just share some takeaways to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So here are how we're able to do that and get students from being, many of them in high risk situations for becoming perpetrators of violence. Several of them already have. Several of our students in this group are already gang involved or affiliated. And they don't really want to be caught up in that, so they're using that personal experience to create a change in their city. while we're also working with them in case management to help get them out of those situations. But some key takeaways of how to really make this grassroots bridge building work and meeting different communities. We meet them where they're at. We're in their schools. We connect with their parents as much as possible. We build relationships first. You're not just going to get to like a youth-led driven campaign to change the city without strong relationships. And it's a lot easier to do that when your facilitators are connected to the communities through demographics, culture, and language. We have a lot of facilitators who are bilingual in the languages of like the largest immigrant populations in DC. We place those facilitators strategically in those schools. I'm working in schools that are in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. We believe that our young people and their parents and teachers are the expert in their own experience, and we organize off of that. We're also make sure that they're given the resources, tools, and autonomy to truly lead. When I've seen the impact be so great when a young person who feels like they're going to be a statistic turns into, no, actually people really believe in me. I have these relationships with all these people who care about me, and I have the ability to actually make an influence on my city. That really changes what their life is going to look like. And so that's what I'm really lucky to do every day. I hope that made sense and I stayed within time.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Dr. Alda, Dr. Campy, all of your presentations were fantastic. Many thanks. You know, we've learned of many different intervention points from our three panelists in terms of addressing violence and crime among youth. Dr. Campy highlighted, you know, that specific targeted approaches where staff are really clear on the mechanisms of change seem particularly effective in the work done in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Alda spoke with us about the Proponte Mas family-focused factors, which just finished talking about the pioneer, you know, the diverse unity.
Heidi, I think we lost.
Which is, oh. Can you all hear me?
You're back now.
Can you now?
Maybe better without
Okay.
your video, Heidi.
Okay.
We lost you again.
Yeah, it seems like we might have lost Heidi, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Many apologies, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's
Hi,
better.
everyone. Can you hear me?
You're still cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay. Then we may just go straight to Q&A and forget my closing comments here. Let's see. Am I coming through?
Heidi, I think we should just go straight to Q&A since we only have 10 minutes.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And if someone else can pick it up, I'd appreciate it since I'm unstable here.
I can perhaps jump in here. Thanks, Heidi. So we're looking through questions here. I'm just going to sort of start here from the top. There's a comment about being surprised how little gender and gender formation, including toxic masculinity, showed up in evaluations. Is that a reflection of the number of interventions working on gender, or is this an artifact of evaluation quality? There's simply not high quality evaluations of these. So I think this is perhaps for Trish, but anyone else?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I have a good answer for that question. I think it's a good question, but yeah, it could be a combination of those two things, and it's a theoretical concept. So like measuring toxic masculinity would not, that's probably pretty tough to do, like in like actionable terms, like behavioral terms. So that may also be a reason why it's not, included in intervention studies.
Great. Thanks, Trish. Feel free to, if you have any sort of big idea questions, to put them in the chat box. Next one, Eric, is for you. I'm interested in knowing if the intervention model is the same, length, phases, activities with families that experience domestic violence and parental substance abuse as compared to those that do not experience those within the family.
Me perdí la primera.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so basically I did respond to the Victoria things, right? Yeah. So essentially, luckily we didn't have any cases, or at least that we knew of, domestic violence, because then that would have to be reported to the authorities, right? So if, for example, there are some issues within the family in one of the phases, then the counselors will spend more time, or they have more sessions within that phase to work with the family before they move on to the next phase. So there was quite a bit of a variation in the dosage of the program. So it ranged from like 600 minutes, in 6 months to actually almost 1,300 minutes. So maybe those families who spend more time, sort of the upper end of the number of minutes, then they probably had some issues. Or those who, can you guys mute, please? So those who were in the upper end in terms of minutes, then they would probably not. They have to work through some issues within the family, whether it's communication, whether it's organization, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, and the second question, that was, if the family counselors were professional psychologists. Yeah, these were clinical psychologists, all of them, that they were trained on the family systems model. So we had what's his name? It skips the name now. Guillermo Céspedes, who had been the kind of father, so to say, of this system, family systems model in LA. Said then he was working, with creative, and he was it was in the field in Honduras, and he provided all the training to all the psychologists and the clinical psychologists on how to implement this family counseling intervention. So these people were not from the community. They might be from other communities, but they've had prior experience in working with at-risk families and youth in violent communities.
Great, thanks, Eric. There's another question that was answered also by Eric online around cost-benefit analysis, and if it was possible to forecast the costs if these Honduran stakeholders were able to continue the interventions beyond USAID finding, and the answer there was no. Just for those, I have a lot of questions around cost-benefit analysis, but for the sort of time's sake, maybe if we could go around. I don't see any other questions. I'm looking here. I think it would be good, perhaps one final round with everyone, and perhaps you can answer this question and then just say sort of your perhaps takeaway, something you want everyone to come away with from your respective presentations. But recognizing all the various layers needed to reduce community level violence and with young people in particular, which levels would you say are the most important in terms of perhaps the entry point? So why don't we start? And I don't know if Heidi's on. Heidi, are you able to?
I'm here. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Many apologies, everyone, for virtual failings here.
No worries.
Matthew's taken over wonderfully. Yeah, I mean, let me see if I can share that question, but we can just go in order if helpful, Dr. Campy, if you want.
Sure. So I would say that we should start, we should focus on the communities that are experiencing the most trauma right now, because the children growing up in those communities are the ones who, 15, 20 years from now are going to be in these intervention programs.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Alda?
Yeah, I would agree in spirit with what Tricia said, but I would also go, you know, these are also the most violent communities, or those who have trauma probably are also quote unquote the easiest to intervene, right? So those communities that may not seem to have a lot of trauma, but is more underlying, I think would be also be useful to do research on. In the case of Ponte Mas, we had, you know, families and communities of all sorts, right? So we had like extremely violent communities where you actually had to negotiate with the gangs to go in and do interventions, with others that, you know, it was easy access. And, you know, we did find that in both types of communities that, you know, intervention did work. So I think it's a bit of both. I would also, and this is from a personal point of view, I think it's just sort of the institutional aspects, right? Because, you know, it's important that communities are able to, you know, address the issues of crime and violence, but we have in many of these countries limited institutional capacity. There's been, you know, improvements in the past 2 decades, but there's still a long way to go. And particularly those who work with youth at conflict in the law, as Trish was saying, these are going to be returning citizens, and, you know, per the system, they may be, you know, rehabilitated, but then they go back to the same risk factors and the same, you know, levels of violence. So how do they cope when they go back, whether it is, you know, through the treatment they have received in the, you know, in the detention center, or with the treatment or the services that the institutions may provide in the communities, will also be useful to try to, you know, clamp down on risky behavior, delinquency, and ultimately high levels of violence.
Thank you. And Tyler, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important, as kind of to the point of using the Honduras example. Funding comes and goes to run these programs. So I think it's really, really important, and something that I try to do is work myself out of a job. Like, I want the young people I work with to have these skills and to be able to teach and facilitate them and keep this work going beyond the length of a program or a grant. I think it's really important to distribute those conflict resolution tools and protective factors and try to get it out to reach as many people as possible, because we know so much about this work is uncertain and underfunded. So I think that's what I really want to hone in on here.
Fantastic. You know, just a closing comment, if I may. I don't see any other questions. It strikes me across many of the most effective interventions that Dr. Campy reviewed, thinking about a family-focused intervention where you're working to strengthen relationships between parents and children and throughout everyone in the household, that Dr. Alda discussed, and Tyler's incredible work in bringing young people together to affect change. I mean, at the very basic level, we're talking about positive relationships, right? We're talking about strengthening relationships between people that are healthy and that help us feel connected to each other. And, you know, in this era of coronavirus, I mean, that discussion one is.
I think you're cutting out again, Heidi.
We lost you again. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll hand it over.
Okay. No, not a problem. Great. Well, you know, I want to close out just by thanking everyone for joining. We had, I think, at one point more than 50 participants. You know, Heidi, Trish, Eric, Tyler, fascinating. For me, I'm not in this space. Certainly work with young people, but not deeply in the violence prevention space. Really learned a lot. So really, thank you. Thanks again. Also, Christy did a lot, or the bulk of, I think, the organizing for this event. We sort of tag team, and so thank you, Christy, for all that you did to bring all these great folks together. Sid for hosting. Heidi, no worries about I think we've all experienced what you did at some point in the last certainly weeks. I think for those of you, I didn't formally introduce myself. Christy and I are the work group co-chairs. I'm the regional director for Africa and the Middle East at the International Youth Foundation, And so, you know, the fascinating highlights for me are really I'm going to try and quickly summarize, and perhaps Heidi was going to say some of this. You know, youth and children are impacted by trauma. We know that, and it's normal. There are a variety of issues: mental health, aggression, bullying, school achievement, many issues that get raised. Trish shared how there has been some work done, but really there's a lack of strong evidence and quality data and studies, especially related to implementation. And so important perhaps to focus on tertiary populations as we do start to try and focus on some of those studies and get more data. Proponte Mas and Eric, I think, showed signs that there are some positive results perhaps coming from some family counseling and other related interventions. And then for me, Tyler was really sort of getting down to the basics of building relationships with young people, and how do we make sure their voices are heard, they're positioned to be experts themselves, and they are able to take on proactively issues such as a gun violence campaign. And you know, for certainly my work, the importance of engaging the entire ecosystem of actors, so here parents and young people and community and schools and others, is really critical to helping, you know, take a systems approach and making a difference to ensure that we're all being responsive to young people's needs, certainly in this case related to violence. So, you know, I'll close and just say, you know, the recording and presentation materials will be on the SID site. Please join us for the next event. As Christy said at the beginning, we had a meeting last year where we had some priority topics. We talked about in the fall, sport for development was a topic, sport as a platform. This is violence prevention. The one coming up is going to be related probably to youth in agriculture and youth inclusive market systems. So those of you who are interested, certainly feel free to reach out. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else, Christy, before we say final goodbye.
Just a thank you to everybody for joining and to all of our wonderful speakers. It was really interesting.
Great. And Paul, anything on your
everybody.
end?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. The one last thing I'll say is that we really would appreciate your feedback from today's event. We have my colleague posted a note about the just a quick survey. If you'd be willing to fill it out, we really would appreciate it. It was sent out at 11:30. It looks like. I know there are a few messages that came in afterwards, but thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event soon.
Great. Stay safe.
Yes, stay safe, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.